Hola, hola, hola. ¿Qué pasa, amigos? Bienvenidos al canal. Mi nombre es Austin, and today's video continues our series on Spanish verb conjugation. Today we'll cover the second tense in the subjunctive mood, the imperfect, which is the subjunctive's past tense, and it might just be my favorite Spanish tense, if it even makes sense to have a favorite, but I'm nerdy like that, okay? So don't judge. The videos in this series are designed to be watched in order, and I strongly recommend that you at least watch my last video on the present subjunctive tense, which goes in depth on the purpose and uses of the subjunctive. The hardest part of the subjunctive really is just getting used to understanding when to use it. Once you understand that, the actual conjugation part isn't nearly as difficult. To recap that video, the indicative mood is used for talking objectively on things, and the subjunctive mood is used for talking subjectively on things. Now, the imperfect subjunctive is the past tense of the subjunctive mood, and it's used in pretty much all the same ways as the present subjunctive, plus a few more unique uses. Just like I taught you in my video on the present subjunctive tense, which is conjugated by altering the indicative present jo form, the imperfect subjunctive is conjugated by altering an indicative form as well. Here we need to start with the preterite third person plural form for ellos, ellas, and ustedes. I'll throw up the preterite conjugations real quick, but I've done a separate video on conjugating into the preterite tense, so you can watch that video using the link up top if you want a refresher. Now, be warned, the preterite is probably the most irregular tense in Spanish. While there are patterns that help us conjugate our irregular verbs in the preterite, it has a lot more rules to go over and should really get its own video at some point. The good news is that the most irregular verbs are also the most commonly used and are often used as root words in derivative verbs which share the same conjugations. As we go through this video, I'll share the preterite conjugations for any irregular verbs we come across. All regular and irregular preterite third-person plural conjugations end in ron. Fun fact, ron is actually the Spanish word for rum. Once we have our preterite third-person plural conjugation, whether the verb is regular or not, we need to drop the ron at the end of the word, then we'll replace it with the appropriate endings. Keep in mind that all AR, ER, and IR verbs end with ron in the preterite third-person plural form, so we'll handle them all the same exact way when we conjugate into the imperfect subjunctive. Now, something interesting about the imperfect subjunctive, and part of the reason why it's my favorite tense, is that it's the only verb tense in Spanish which has two different conjugation sets that are both considered equally correct, though one is far more commonly used than the other. Now, you might be wondering why the imperfect subjunctive is the only tense with two sets of conjugations. If so, I applaud your curiosity, but this is a video on the Spanish language, not linguistic history, so I'm not going to get into all that today. Maybe another time. What you do need to know is that I recommend you only use the more common one in your speech, and I'm going to teach you the second one only so that you can learn to recognize it when you see or hear it somewhere. The more common conjugation set is going to replace the ron at the end of the third person plural preterite with the following: ra for yo, ras for tú and vos, ra for él, ella, and usted, ramos for nosotros, nosotras, rais for vosotros, vosotras, and ran for ellos, ellas, and ustedes. These conjugations all stress the syllable just before the R that starts the ending. And with the nosotros conjugation, we need to make sure we stress the vowel just before that ramos, whether for an AR or ER-IR verb. So we need to add an accent mark over that vowel to make sure we follow the standard pronunciation rules. For example, the imperfect subjunctive nosotros form for hablar is habláramos, and for comer, it's comiéramos. All right, so the second, less commonly used conjugation form is found more in literary contexts. It starts the same way by dropping the ron and adding the endings, but these endings are as follows. Se for yo, ses for tú and vos, se for él, ella, and usted, semos for nosotros, nosotras, seis for vosotros, vosotras, and sen for ellos, ellas, and ustedes. We still need to accent the syllable just before the S in the nosotros form, so hablar becomes hablásemos, and comer becomes comiésemos. Now, you might be wondering, can't I just conjugate my verb straight into the imperfect without starting with the preterite? Well, yes, you absolutely can, as long as the verb is regular in the preterite. Assuming your verb is regular, just drop the AR, ER, or IR, and you can conjugate into the imperfect subjunctive straight from the infinitive form. And I'll throw those endings up on the screen for you now so you can pause here to review them. All right, now that we know our conjugations, let's get into using the imperfect subjunctive in our speech. To those of you who have already seen my last video on the subjunctive present tense, this next part should be pretty easy for you. We're using the same sorts of triggers we learned then using the weirdo acronym, but we're just speaking subjectively through a past tense lens. If you haven't seen that video yet, now's your last chance to go check it out, or this next section may be a bit confusing for you. When we want to talk about what we wished would happen in the past, we'll use the imperfect subjunctive tense. For example, if we want to tell our friend, I wanted you to come to the concert with me, that would translate as, quería que vinieras al concierto conmigo. You can see how we could easily move this sentence into the present tense and say, quiero que vengas al concierto conmigo. Same sentence, just a different time frame. Another way we'll use this tense is to give our opinion on past events using impersonal expressions, such as, it's so weird that he already sold his car, which translates to, es tan raro que ya vendiera su coche. Side note, to those of you who've been following my videos, you may have noticed that I've used 3 different words so far for car: carro, auto, and coche. Something we as Spanish learners need to get used to is that certain words are used specific to certain regions. In this example, coche is used most in España, and auto is used more in a few countries including Argentina and Uruguay, and carro is used more in the rest of Latin America. As you progress through your learning journey, try to familiarize yourself more with the regional vocabulary for the people that you expect you'll be speaking with the most often, and learn the alternatives so that you can recognize them when you speak with people from other places. This is the same reason why I've been teaching you vos and vosotros. Even though most of you won't be using those subjects, as you immerse yourself further in the Spanish-speaking world, you'll almost certainly hear a native speaker using these subjects at some point or another. All right, let's get back to our main topic. Another way we'll use the subjunctive in the past tense is to express wishes that are considered unlikely or pretty much unattainable. One example is, I wish I were an elephant, which is true for me, by the way. I freaking love elephants. This sentence translates as, ojalá fuera un elefante. All right, so our next usage is something I covered in my video on the indicative conditional tense, if-would statements. When we want to talk about what would happen if something else happened first, then that if condition is conjugated in the imperfect subjunctive tense. One example is, if I had a time machine, I'd ride a dinosaur, which becomes, si tuviera una máquina del tiempo, montaría un dinosaurio. The last example I'll share before our practice section is for polite requests. Now, lots of Spanish teachers like to tell their students to order in restaurants using this method. Now, although it technically works, it's far from the best way to order food because it can be seen as too formal and hypothetical, and it's just not really how natives usually order food. But using this construction, if we felt like ordering a hamburger with fries, we could say, quisiera una hamburguesa con papas fritas. Again, save this method for more formal situations, and I'll teach you better ways to order food in another video sometime. Alright, now that we know how to conjugate the imperfect subjunctive tense and when to use it, it's time to lock in our understanding with some practice rounds. Like usual, I'm going to give you some sentences in English and translate them into Spanish with our target verbs unconjugated. I'll share with you the preterite form conjugations for any irregular verbs, and it'll be up to you to come up with the correct imperfect subjunctive conjugations. Are you ready? Empecemos. Our first example is, I was looking for a hotel that faced the sea. Our unconjugated translation is, buscaba un hotel que dar al mar. The verb dar, which is irregular, usually means to give, but here we can use it followed by the word a to mean to face, used mostly with rooms and buildings. Mar is a masculine noun, so the sea is el mar. In Spanish, when the word el follows the word a, they contract into al. Ready for the answer? Buscaba un hotel que diera al mar. All right, our next example is, I wish they had bought my trampoline. If they did, I'd use that money to buy myself a new guitar. Our translation is, ojalá haber comprado mi trampolín. Si lo hacer, yo usaría ese dinero para comprarme una guitarra nueva. Haber and hacer are both irregular, and the preterite conjugations are up on the screen for you now. In this example, we're using haber comprado to say had bought, and that will make more sense when I release the video on the perfect tenses. So do you think you've got the answer? Let's find out. Ojalá hubieran comprado mi trampolín. Si lo hicieran, yo usaría ese dinero para comprarme una guitarra nueva. All right, are you ready for one more? Our last example is, if I were an astronaut, I'd go to the moon. If I went to the moon, I'd write my name in the sand. Our translation is, si ser astronauta, iría a la luna. Si ir a la luna, escribiría mi nombre en la arena. Ser and ir are both irregular and share the exact same preterite conjugations. Before revealing the answers, I do want to point out something about that word, astronauta. In Spanish, many nouns describing professions will end in an O to describe men and an A to describe women. However, there are plenty of examples of professions that end with an A to describe both men and women. Some examples are astronauta, dentista, and artista. If we're describing a male artist, we'll say el artista, and for a woman, we'll say la artista. Make sure you're careful when learning new vocabulary to ensure you don't accidentally make up new words that don't actually exist in Spanish. Okay, back to our example. You think you've got it? Si fuera astronauta, iría a la luna. Si fuera a la luna, escribiría mi nombre en la arena. So how'd you do? Did you get all the answers? If not, that's okay, but you might consider going back to review the preterite conjugations and revisit the conjugation table for the imperfect subjunctive tense. If you got all the answers right, que chévere! Well, that's all I have for you today. Our next video is on the future subjunctive, and you're going to learn how to, just kidding, though the future subjunctive is a real tense, it's barely used nowadays. So we're done with the subjunctive for now. Our next video will teach you how to give commands using the imperative mood in Spanish, and you'll be able to say things like, no me molestes, déjame en paz. I'd be so grateful if you were to help me grow my new channel. If you've liked today's video, let me know with that like button. If you have any questions for me or want to practice making your own sentences, drop a comment down below. And if you want to stay up to date with me on all the coming lessons, make sure you're subscribed. Te veo en el próximo video. Hasta entonces!